When we think about World War I, we picture trenches, empires clashing, and just this immense, tragic loss of life. But what if I told you there was another war happening right underneath the surface? A secret war, not for land, but for the one resource that was about to change everything. We're going to explore how this wasn't just an imperial conflict. It was the world's first global war for oil.
And that quote right there, it just changes everything, doesn't it? It suggests that behind all the battles we know so well, there was this hidden fight over energy, a struggle that would define not just who won the war, but the entire political map of the century to come.
So, to really get this, we've got to rewind a bit to before the first shots were fired. The British Empire, the biggest superpower on the planet, ran on one thing: coal. It powered their factories, their trains, and, most importantly, their navy, which ruled the waves. And the best part for them? They had tons of it, right at home. It was the bedrock of their global dominance.
But there was a problem brewing. A new technology was on the horizon, and with it came this absolutely terrifying new vulnerability. The top brass in London started to realize that the very thing that made them so powerful, all that coal, could actually be their fatal weakness in the next big war. The foundation of their empire was starting to look, well, obsolete.
And just look at the difference here. It's night and day. Coal-fired ships, they were a nightmare to refuel. It was this slow, dirty, back-breaking job. You needed huge crews of men, stokers, just shoveling coal into furnaces around the clock. But oil was a total game changer. It packed more punch, you could pump it aboard in a fraction of the time, and it gave warships this incredible new speed and range. The military advantage was just undeniable.
So what do you do when your greatest strength is suddenly your biggest liability? Well, you take a huge risk. You make a massive gamble. And that is exactly what Britain did, pushed forward by one very, very determined man.
That man was Winston Churchill. As the head of the Navy, he championed the decision to convert the entire British fleet from coal to oil. Now, think about how insane this was. Britain was giving up its energy independence, that secure domestic supply of coal, for the superior performance of a fuel that it didn't have, a fuel it had to ship from the other side of the world.
And this is how they manage that enormous risk. Right before the war breaks out, the British government does something completely unprecedented. They step in and buy a majority share of a private company, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. Suddenly, the line between government and corporation just evaporates. The security of the British Empire is now officially tied to a company drilling for oil in the Middle East. And that quote right there just nails the consequence. All of a sudden, some dusty oil field in Persia, what we now call Iran, became as strategically important to Britain's survival as a naval base in England. Distant places weren't just dots on a colonial map anymore. They were the gas stations for the entire empire.
All right, so let's see what this actually meant when the war finally kicked off. Because this new dependence on oil created this hidden, absolutely massive advantage for one side and a crippling weakness for the other. I mean, just look at these numbers. The Allies, Britain, France, Russia, and later the United States, they controlled more than 70% of all the world's oil. That's not a slight edge, that's a stranglehold. It was the logistical dominance that would quietly shape pretty much every major campaign, especially as the war got more and more mechanized.
And on the flip side, things were looking pretty grim. The Central Powers were basically running on fumes. The little oil they had was in vulnerable spots, or the fields were totally undeveloped. It meant Germany and its allies were constantly scrambling for fuel. And in a new age of tanks and airplanes, that's a death sentence.
So this is the secret war we're talking about. While everyone was reading about the horrors of the trenches, there was this other, quieter war being fought. A war of logistics, of oil tankers and pipelines. It was a race to fuel the new killing machines. The tanks, the U-boats, the fighter planes. The side that could keep its engines running had the upper hand.
And this fight for fuel wasn't just happening in some back office. It literally redrew the map of the war. It turned places that most people had never even heard of into the most important battlegrounds on Earth.
Take Mesopotamia, what we now call Iraq. One of the very first things Britain did when the Ottoman Empire entered the war wasn't to attack them in Europe. No, they sent troops straight to Mesopotamia in November 1914. Their mission? To protect the oil fields and pipelines of that little company they now owned. It was an invasion driven purely by the need for energy. And it wasn't a one-sided thing. The Central Powers knew exactly what was at stake.
One of the main goals for the Ottoman Empire's entire campaign in the Caucasus was to capture the city of Baku. Why? Because Baku was one of the biggest oil centers in the entire world. Control Baku, and you control industrial power itself. Or look at Romania. Its oil fields were a massive prize. When Romania joined the Allies, that oil was a huge boost. So when the Central Powers advanced and the Romanians had to retreat, they and their British allies went scorched earth. They systematically destroyed their own oil wells and refineries just to deny that precious fuel to the enemy. You know, this quote just cuts right through all the noise. Behind all the grand speeches about national destiny and glory, there was this much colder, harder calculation. It was empire, sure, but it was empire with a balance sheet. Securing an oil field was a strategic business decision dressed up in patriotic language. So what's the big takeaway from all this? Well, it turns out this secret war for oil wasn't some historical footnote. It actually created the blueprint for how global power would operate for the next 100 years, and counting. The war basically carved this three-step pattern into stone. Step 1, your country gets hooked on a critical resource you don't have at home. Step 2, that reliance becomes a massive strategic vulnerability. And step 3, the state then uses all of its power, military, economic, you name it, to secure that resource. That pattern, forged in the First World War over oil, is still playing out all over the world today.
Seriously, think about it. The whole idea of governments owning stakes in energy companies, the intense geopolitical focus on the Middle East, using your navy to protect shipping lanes, these pillars of modern foreign policy feel so normal to us now, but they weren't invented yesterday. Their DNA is right here, forged in the fires of World War I.
And that brings us to one last really important question for today. That same logic, the one that turned oil from a commodity into a weapon, it's still with us. Maybe today's critical resource isn't oil. Maybe it's semiconductors or rare earth minerals for our batteries, or even the massive data centers that power our AI. So the question we've got to ask ourselves is, what's the resource we're becoming completely dependent on, and is the secret war for it already underway?